The largest mental health care facility in the United States is the Los Angeles County jail system. We wait until someone else is hurt, and then we arrest the person who's mentally ill and put them in the jail system, which is the worst possible thing you could do. This is not adequate. This is not humane. This is not civilized. This has to stop.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. We got a really important discussion a bit later on in today's episode about this unbelievably festering problem in California and in other parts of the country too, homelessness. And we get really deep into it because my policy organization, Golden Together, we just published a report called Ending Homelessness. And two of the people who helped us write that report are with us with all the detail you need about this incredible issue. And it's just yet another example of a terrible problem that is completely avoidable because it is directly caused by bad government policy, bad ideas. It is infuriating. When you listen to this, you just think, I cannot believe that this is where we are. But it is where we are, and we need to understand it if we're going to change it. So that's coming up. But I did want to start on a happier note, actually. I'm a little bit hoarse and tired because I just got back from Ohio. Which is not a place I go very often, but I was there last night. I'm taping this on Tuesday morning, February the 25th. And last night I was in Ohio, and I was there to support my friend who you know very well, Vivek Ramaswamy. He's a really, really good friend of mine. I'm really fond of Vivek. I've got to know him over the years. And he just announced that he's running for governor of Ohio. And I went to support him. I spoke at the two events, the first one in Cincinnati, very close to his childhood home. Very emotional event. It was really great. And then the second one near Columbus. And I wanted to talk about it, first of all, just because I just love the fact that he's stepping up and he's such a powerful leader in so many different ways. And I want to, play you a little bit of what I said at the event. And then I'll expand on it on the other side. Listen to what I said. I think this was the first event in Cincinnati.
I just want to make one point to you as you think about what you're about to hear and about what leadership is all about. It's not enough to have the right ideas. Of course you need the right ideas. We all saw what happened in the last 4 years when we had the wrong ideas running our country, and look at the difference when we now have the right ideas in charge. And this man that we are here for tonight, he has the right ideas, and as Dan was saying earlier, he had the right ideas before most other people on all the big issues of our time. Vivek has been right before anyone else. He was out there fighting for those ideas. But it wasn't just talk. With this man, it is action as well. He gets it done. He didn't just highlight before anyone else the destructive role of the left trying to take over our entire economy through ESG and Woke Inc. and all the things that you know Vivek has been talking about for years. He didn't just talk about it. He didn't just write a book about it. He started a company to actually make the change happen in the real world. That is why you have a very special person here tonight. Not just a politician who talks, someone who's an entrepreneur who gets things done. That is what this state needs. That is what our country needs. And so I just want to leave with this thought. What you're about to see tonight is not just the special qualities of this man that I'm proud to call my friend. You're looking at the future. You're looking at the future for this state. You'll be looking at the future for this country. Because this man, Vivek Ramaswamy, he is the future that we need for our communities and for our country. And that's why I'm so very, very proud to be here tonight. That combination, my friend Vivek Ramaswamy, your great state of Ohio, together, it's going to be magic. It's going to be amazing. Let's show Vivek how much we love him and how much we're looking forward to hearing from him tonight. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
And to me, that is such a great American story. I mean, he really is in so many ways the personification of the American dream. A guy, and actually with great pleasure of being there last night was to meet his family. I know Vivek's wife, actually we've met over the years, but I'd never met his parents before. I had a great conversation with his parents who came here from India, and their son has just become, this great, example of everything we want in terms of the American dream. Starting businesses, doing really successfully there, great academic result, Harvard and Yale, and all these different things, an author, and then a media personality, and then he ran for president, and now he's running for governor. He got endorsed by President Trump. I mean, the whole thing is just a fantastic story. And they got a wonderful family, and it just captures the very best of what we want for America, which is this spirit of grasping opportunities and can do, and just going out there and grabbing things. These stories just don't happen in other countries. It was a truly American thing that I felt incredibly happy and proud to be part of. But there's another aspect to it that I thought was really interesting. It was very interesting for me to listen and watch Vivek speaking about Ohio, because of course, all the conversations that I've had with him over the years on this show and on my Fox show and elsewhere have been focused on a more national conversation. Of course, he made that great argument in his book, Woke Inc., about the way that the left were using ESG, environmental and social governance, to take over basically the entire economy through forcing giant corporations to push left-wing ideological positions. And he was absolutely instrumental in fighting that back. The arguments that we've had over the years, the arguments he's been making that we've agreed on and talked about in terms of the role of the administrative state and all of that. So all these things we've talked about in the past with Vivek and I have been at the national level. Really interesting to see him focus that and his brain and his ideas on Ohio, his home state, and what he would do as governor. And the thing that really stood out to me, and this is what, of course, I'm thinking of it as I'm watching him in relation to California and what's going on here, which is very much my focus these days. And the thing that really, that made an impact on me watching him was this very American truth that because of the size and scale of this country and the genius of the founders and the Constitution, in particular, federalism, states are actually the place where you see real innovation and leadership in terms of governance. And you see the results, and people move. This is not like other countries. People and businesses move, and you've got market testing, as it were, of the best ideas. And the thing that brought that home to me was when he was talking about Ohio's history. And now we may think about Ohio, and even he talked about this as, a bit of a joke, and it's run down and deindustrialized Midwest and ghost towns and so on, where the factories closed down. And some of those images may be what we think of in terms of Ohio, hillbilly elegy and all of that. From J.D. Vance. But he made the point that not that long ago, I mean, certainly at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Ohio was the center of it all and really the leading state in America. But he made the point that even more recently than that, in the 1960s, if I'm remembering him correctly from last night, he said that in the 1960s, 6 out of the top 15 wealthiest cities in America were all in Ohio. Places like Toledo and Cincinnati and Columbus, the world leaders in different industries, like Akron, he was saying, I think, was rubber, and Toledo was glass, not that long ago. And the point that brings home to me is we can't be complacent about anything, because America is dynamic, because you have states and they can go in a different direction. And I'm thinking about this in relation to California specifically. Last night, Vivek was saying, yes, it's true that Silicon Valley's been at the edge of the technological revolution for the last 20 years or so, but I want Ohio to be that for the next 20 years. And by the way, that's perfectly possible, because you see what's happening now. Businesses leaving California because of our incredibly inhospitable business climate, the worst in the nation, 10 years in a row, according to Chief Executive Magazine. And then if you put someone in like Vivek Ramaswamy, who really understands the right policies that need to be implemented, plus you have a Republican legislature there that can help change the laws, you could really imagine a turnaround. And to be precise, it's already happening. So there's a company called Anduril. I was talking to the Secretary of State last night at Vivek's event, Republican, and we were just chatting about this whole economic situation, how they're climbing up the ladder of places that are good for business. Ohio's doing better and better at that. And there's a specific example, Anduril, a great company. I know the founder, Palmer Luckey. It's a defense technology company. They're reinventing the way we think about defense and drones and military. It's fantastic. Great example of American innovation and leadership. Well, guess what? It's founded in Orange County, and the next big facility, 4,000 jobs, drone technology is going to be built in Ohio, not here in California. And so things do change and policies do matter. And actually, right now, because of the attitude that we're seeing, which I completely agree with, you've heard me talk about it many times, the 10th Amendment, which states that the powers not specifically listed in the Constitution are, quote, reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That concept of decentralizing power is very much part of what you're seeing from the Trump administration right now. That's the idea behind closing down the Department of Education, send it back to the states. You're going to see that as the consequence of what's happening with Doge. Obviously, the headlines right now are all about, the specific examples of egregious waste or ideologically driven spending. And of course, what's happening with the workforce and who's responding to Elon's emails and all that kind of stuff. That's the day-to-day drama. But the longer term consequence of what's going on is that a lot of power is going to be restored to the states where it belongs. That means that states have the power to really drive their destiny. And what that means for California, which is long, I think these Democrats who've been in charge, totally complacent. They keep bragging about how we're the fifth largest economy in the world, all this kind of stuff, as if that's going to go on forever. And everyone else is just going to, sit still and just take it. No, you're already seeing states, obviously Florida, forging ahead with its freedom agenda on taxes and regulations and all these things and attracting business and people as a result. And you can see it in the flows of people from more highly taxed, highly regulated states like California, New York, and Illinois. The population is moving to places like Florida and Tennessee and attracting business. So this is a really big deal. It's a great thing about America that we have that kind of competition within our country. That's why we produce these world-beating industries. And you can travel around this country, and everywhere you go, you have different sectors and amazing companies that pop up here and there, totally different to most other countries. In the UK, pretty much everything happens in London. If you're not in London, it doesn't really count. That's the attitude there. Not like that in America. We have this incredible diversity, this competition, this innovation. It is great. It's great. It's great for the states that are doing the right things and forging ahead. But it's a disaster if you're a state like California and you're not aware of this and you're just sitting back thinking we can do the same old things and we're going to continue to retain the investment and the jobs and the opportunities. That is not how it works. And so just as we do find it surprising to hear that 6 of the top 15 wealthiest cities in America a few decades ago were in Ohio. Well, maybe they'll be saying that once about California and say, oh, there was a day when California was really wealthy. Not anymore. That's the day. That's the point we have to avoid. And that's why we need change here in California. Anyway, all of this was brought home to me by being there with Vivek last night. It was a great honor and joy to be with him and his family, his friends and supporters. But it also made me think of what a job we have on our hands right here in California. All right, joining us now for a very special discussion. I'm going to call it California Corner because Susan Shelley is part of it. And as you know, Susan is our regular for all things California. But we're also joined by Michele Steeb. Now, if you follow the Big Ideas Book Club, my other podcast, you'll know we had some fantastic conversations with Michele on the question of homelessness, which she's been working on directly for so long. We'll hear about that in a moment. But the reason for having both of you on is that we just put out a report from Golden Together, my California policy organization, on homelessness. And both of you have been part of that, have contributed to that report and really helped me put it together. But more than that, educated me on this whole issue. So I'm really thrilled to have you together to talk about this particular report. We're going to focus on homelessness. And what I really want to do, I'm going to start with something that just laying it out there in terms of, obviously, to solve the crisis. I mean, we don't need to explain why it's a crisis. We have by far the highest number and rate of homeless people in the country, however you measure it. We have roughly 26%, I think it is, of the total homeless population. We have 45% of the unsheltered homeless population, people living on the street, even though we have only 11% or so of the total population. So it's just a massive California crisis. To understand how we fix it, we have to understand why we have this crisis. And the person that really helped me understand that best was Susan. When we first started talking about this, you really laid it out for me in terms of 3 categories. And I want to start the discussion there. with the two of you, and the three particular things that really were at the heart of this problem and how it's metastasized. Well, number one, this absolutely terrible policy called Housing First, which sounds great, but is a disaster. Michele knows all about that, and she's going to explain that in a second. Number two, the failure to enforce anti-camping ordinances and to actually remove homeless encampments. And there's all sorts of arguments about Supreme Court rulings that allegedly stop that happening. There's much more to that than meets the eye. Susan, you can tell us about that. And then thirdly, also for you, Susan, the question that you put on my radar, which is mental health, and how really long-standing rules from Medicaid are getting in the way of doing what needs to be done on mental health, which is such a big part of the homelessness crisis. So those are the three categories. Michele, let's start with you. Tell us about Housing First.
Sure. Well, Housing First was initially introduced in 2008 in the Bush administration as a program for the chronically homeless, which at that time had a little bit of a different definition, but essentially meant people that had long-term homelessness. A lot of them were living on the street and costing the system a lot of money because they were interacting with public health and public safety and all the things we're aware of. That model was then in 2013 introduced in the Obama administration as a one-size-fits-all approach to homelessness without any evidence that it would work for all the segments of the population beyond the chronically homeless population. As you said earlier today, we're now at the highest point ever in our nation's history, the highest number of unsheltered, which ironically, again, Housing First was developed largely for that population. But also the death rate has increased by at least 238%. So what is Housing First? Housing First, as you mentioned, prioritizes the placement of homeless individuals in individual housing units that are subsidized for life. In those housing units, there is no allowance for requirements, meaning you cannot require sobriety, you cannot require employment training, you cannot require engagement in any sorts of services like addiction services or mental health services. The idea, again, for the chronically homeless population, when you place them in housing, is once they're in housing, they'll be able to self-determine their need for those services. The reality is that doesn't happen. They are too sick to self-determine their need for those services. And in fact, there's a study out of Boston that we've talked about before, which followed the placement of the chronically homeless in these subsidized units without any treatment services. And after 5 years, nearly half of the cohort was dead. It is a massively failed policy. It really engenders dependency versus helping people restore and rebuild their lives, which is what we need to be focused on.
Could you explain the connection between, the origin was federal, but then, first of all, why does that matter for California's policy? And then what did California do?
Thank you for those questions. So the federal government is the largest singular funder of homelessness. So most of its dollars actually go right from the federal government as it relates to homelessness directly to counties or COCs and now cities. California, so all that money that comes in to California from the federal government is largely a little bit to the state, but a lot of it's going to the local levels.
What was a COC? Sorry, Michele, I didn't.
Sorry, that's a bureaucracy, if you can believe it, that HUD created, another bureaucracy that they created to administer their homeless grants at the local level. Most counties throughout the country are still administering those grants, but there's about 440 COCs across the country, which were added into the mix, which I could go on and on about how
But what does it
disastrous
stand
that's
for?
been. Excuse me?
What does it stand for?
Continuum of care.
Okay. Right.
Yes.
Okay. So then,
So
so most of the homelessness money is federal, goes through the counties, and then California doubled
in
down, right? Tell us
in
about that.
2016, they were the only state to embed housing first into state statute. And as you have pointed out earlier, California has had the biggest explosion across the country in overall homelessness and unsheltered homelessness in particular. One of the things I wanted to point out, I don't want to get too far off track here, though, is that Cal Matters came out with a story this morning about the conditions of shelters throughout the state and how horrible it is. And it is, in fact, horrible. The primary reason for this is that under Housing First, again, which the federal government is dollars are tied to and the state dollars are tied to, under Housing First, there's no allowance for requirements. You cannot screen people who are coming into the shelters. You cannot allow for many rules, very few rules. And if you want to get the government funding, right, the Housing First funding. So it is no wonder that in 10 years, our shelters have gone from safe havens that really helped people rebuild their lives. That's what my program in Sacramento started off being, to utter chaos where all your belongings are stolen. It's filthy. It is, there's drugs, there's weapons, there's nothing. No one wants to go because they've become places where criminal activity ensues and they feel more safe on the streets, which is ironic.
So let's just before we move on to, I'm going to draw a line under this and get to the other components. Would it be correct to say that basically what's happening now as a result of this housing first policy is that if you become homeless and you're unsheltered, you're living on the streets, and that could have happened for all sorts of reasons. It could be you lost your job and you couldn't make rent, and then you start staying with friends for a little bit, couch surfing or whatever, and then hospitality runs out and you have to live in your car, and then you can't afford the car. Someone who's perfectly respectable may end up homeless equally. And then once you're there on the streets, you're totally a target for drug dealers, and the stress may make you, mess with your mental health and so on. So, but equally, it could be substance abuse or addiction that tips you into homelessness. Doesn't matter how you got there. Most people, once they're there, have some combination of mental health or substance abuse problems. And it seems to me, look, because of Housing First, there are basically three things the three outcomes here. Either you get put in a housing unit on your own without any requirement to do anything, or you're in a shelter, which is probably even worse because you're surrounded by chaos and crime in the shelter, or you're still on the street. I mean, that's where we're at. It's insane. Susan, let's talk about parts 2 and 3. I just want to make sure we get the whole picture in. So the second part, which was the anti-camping ordinances, I guess this is the rest of the public's view on it. You're like, why is it that for years now we've just got this absolutely appalling squalor and crime risk, and stories of friends who live in Venice Beach and they take their kids to school and they have to navigate an obstacle course of drug paraphernalia and stupefied people sprawled out on the street and the tents on the sidewalks, and people are saying, well, why can't we do something about this?
Well, it used to be the case that there were areas of the cities that were called Skid Row or something similar, and law enforcement tolerated a certain level of dysfunction on the sidewalks in those areas, and in other areas they did not. But in 2005 or thereabouts, the ACLU sued the city of Los Angeles over its ordinance that banned sitting, lying, or sleeping on the street unless you were waiting for a parade. And they said that's overbroad. And it ended up at the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit said, yes, it's overbroad, you can't do that. Well, the city of Los Angeles, rather than go to the Supreme Court and challenge that, said, we're going to settle this case. And here's how we're going to settle it. Everyone is welcome to sleep on the streets overnight anywhere in the city, and we will not enforce the anti-camping ordinance any place within the boundaries of the city of Los Angeles until we build about 1,250 units of affordable housing or housing for the chronically homeless. Well, they built the housing, but they never resumed enforcement. And in the interim, what happened is there was another case. This case was Jones versus City of Los Angeles, this ACLU lawsuit. And it was the part of the settlement about the sidewalk sleeping, part of the settlement was that the case could not be cited as a precedent. It was vacated at the Ninth Circuit. But the judges of the Ninth Circuit took all that reasoning and put it in a case called Martin versus Boise, which said that you cannot enforce an anti-camping ordinance unless you have enough shelter beds for everyone. Well, the definition of what was an acceptable shelter and the definition of who was everyone and when the cities could do anything was so vague that it was just grist for lawsuits anytime a city tried to enforce any kind of anti-camping ordinance anywhere in their cities. Lawsuit after lawsuit, settlement after settlement, stopped cities like San Francisco from doing sensible things. Over and over again, public officials were so frustrated with it. I believe even Gavin Newsom signed an amicus brief arguing to the U.S. Supreme Court that they had to overturn Martin versus Boise, and they did. In Grants Pass versus Johnson last summer, the Supreme Court said cities can enforce an anti-camping ordinance. It's not unconstitutional. If it's generally applicable, they can enforce an anti-camping ordinance. Well, what happened in Los Angeles? The county and city officials immediately announced that they would never do such a thing. Well, there are 88 cities in LA County. Some of them are enforcing an anti-camping ordinance. Where are those people going? Into Los Angeles. So this is creating a crisis in Los Angeles, and the city will not enforce any kind of reasonable anti-camping ordinance, even before that high wind event that resulted in the disastrous fires in Los Angeles County. So that's where this came from, and that's why we have it.
Can I just a couple of questions on that? Who brought all these lawsuits? I mean, you mentioned ACLU was the first one that kind of sent this downward spiral going. Who is it always? Who's bringing these lawsuits when a city tries to do a sensible thing?
Well, there's a handful of lawyers who have filed them over and over again, and there's a lot of money to be made in these settlements, frankly, because the legal fees are paid by the taxpayers. So they make these, and this is why some cities got sued and others didn't. The ones with the deeper pockets probably got sued, because once you start down this path where nobody knows what the federal courts will decide is adequate shelter, nobody knows what the courts, it's so vague. Enough shelter for everybody. What is it? What is a shelter and who is everybody? You get into this discussion. Well, if people come in from out of the state and they set up shop, do you have to find enough shelter for everyone who comes in every day? And what if they won't go? And none of this was addressed. It was just all very vague. So everybody got sued, everybody settled, lawyers got very rich.
So before we get a wider discussion, could you, Susan, hit the third point, which is again, very interesting technical point here, which I wasn't aware of till you told me about it. This is years ago now, which was in relation to mental health, which, as we've discussed, is such a big part of this problem.
Yes, we are leaving money on the table in California because there is a 1965 law, the Medicare and Medicaid Act, which said, and in the 1960s, this made sense to people, we are not going to reimburse for mental health care. The federal government will not reimburse for mental health care provided in an institution because institutions are bad, because we now have these new psychiatric drugs and everyone can be cared for in a community clinic with a prescription, and we don't need to be locking people up in institutions. In 1965, that was very modern and seemed like a good idea at the time, but it didn't work for everybody. What happened as a result financially was all of the mental health hospitals ended up defunded because there was no Medicaid reimbursement, or Medi-Cal in California, no reimbursement for care in these facilities, so the patients were moved to general hospitals. This was bad for the patients, bad for the hospitals, bad for the mental health institutions, which ultimately ended up closed because of financial reasons. It was a terrible thing. Now, what you'll find is a lot of people practicing in this space will say there are not enough beds for people coming out of the prisons, not enough beds for people coming out of the jails, not enough beds for people who wouldn't have to go to jail if there was adequate medical care for them, if there were enough beds. Now you have a situation where you have empty hospitals that people of means have talked about converting to mental health hospitals, and the government tells you, sorry, there's no funding. And what they mean is this Medicaid exclusion, which is called the IMD exclusion, Institutions for Mental Disease. Now, during the first Trump administration, President Trump's HHS department said you can have a waiver If you want to have care in a mental health institution, we will reimburse you if you apply for a waiver. California refused to do it. The governor was lobbied by the Community Care Clinics Association. I forget the name of it. Mental Health America, I believe, was part of the organization that lobbies in Sacramento for community clinics. And they do not like the idea of institutional care. They go back to these snake pit kinds of movies. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and they say, we don't want to go back to that. But what we have is depriving people of adequate medical care for mental illness.
Right.
And this can't go on. This is very dangerous for everyone concerned.
So to be really precise about it, the limit is 16 beds, right?
That's 16 beds.
IMD.
That's the definition of large versus community.
Okay. And you could get a waiver, which the first Trump administration set in place, that you'll get reimbursed to an institution that's larger than that, but California hasn't done it. Can I ask another question before we find the one on this, which is, you hear a lot, even Newsom's been saying this, which is, well, it was all Ronald Reagan's fault on mental health. He shut down the mental institutions. You hear that argument a lot. Susan, could you just address that?
Sure. It was not. That was not the case. The source of this is that the funding dried up for mental hospitals. And so they were trying to save money. They were trying to fund community clinics. This was part of the Lanterman Act, the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act, I think is the full name of it, which said that people can't be institutionalized against their will. It created a whole bunch of different situations that
was a
leaned toward this.
California act.
That was a California act that Governor Reagan signed. And essentially the source of the problem is the Medicaid Act, which cut off funding for mental health facilities with more than 16 beds. And this is specialized care and more expensive to provide, not compatible with the general hospital population.
It's amazing, isn't it? So that's 1965, and we're living with the consequences today. Absolutely amazing.
Steeb,
all right,
can I
Michele,
add one?
yes, I know you're dying to get in. I'm so sorry.
No, well,
Please do.
I want to
wanted
add
get
one
the
thing
facts
that
and
I
then-
forgot to mention is that not only when we rolled out Housing First did we disallow requirements, but we actually took all the money that we were using for mental health and drug and alcohol services, and we moved that money into permanent housing vouchers, right? These lifelong subsidies. So on top of what Susan is saying, right, within Housing First, we've created an added dilemma for people who really need, to be treated for their diseases.
And let's just get into this, which is maybe, I don't know, Susan, you're going to go there, which is that money basically is now going into what we call the homeless industrial complex. Like, it's been sucked into this. So maybe, Susan, you could take this, which is like all this money is being spent on these, what do they call it? Permanent supportive housing.
Permanent supportive housing.
Right. Talk about that a bit.
The central problem, it's a math problem in many respects. If you're going to pay $500,000 to $1 million per unit to construct brand new permanent supportive housing, or to convert hotels or other apartment buildings to permanent supportive housing, the math doesn't work for the number of people who are going to want or need these units. So how are they allocated? Do you allocate them to people who have families and they've lost a job and they're in dire straits because of that? Or do you allocate them equally across the board to people who are still using hard drugs and to families? Do you put those on an equal plane? Housing First says you must put them on an equal plane. You cannot turn away people with criminal records. You cannot turn away people actively using heroin or meth or other really dangerous drugs. You cannot turn them away. So there's a scarcity element to the allocation of this housing. And you have the problem of, let's say you have a building that has 36 units and 5 of them have people who are in the throes of addiction. It destabilizes the whole population of the building. It creates problems for everyone.
So this Housing First, I mean, as you said up at the beginning, Michele, it's a total nightmare because it's diverting the money into these physical units, which are vastly overpriced because of the corruption. I mean, the developers that get in on the act and so on.
And
then
the regulation, yes.
Exactly. And then you can't have any rules requiring any kind of behavioral change. And so it's just a nightmare. Michele, you had a really good analogy about what Housing First really means. You compared it to a hospital.
Yeah. I love to use this. I ask the audiences to close their eyes and, think about someone that they know who has addiction or mental illness, and think about bringing them to a hospital. And you get to the hospital and you go to admin to check in, and they check you in and they put you in a room, and all the nurses are gone, all the doctors are gone, all the medication's gone. All you're left with is your room, and that is really what we've done to the homelessness system. That is Housing First.
Insane. It's so heartbreaking that this it's so true of so many of these problems that we have in California. They're totally avoidable problems because they're created by bad policy and
Yeah.
bad ideas. Susan, can we just talk about, well, let's get into solutions a little bit. I mean, obviously broadly the solution is to not do these bad things that we're doing to reverse all these policies. That's like the basic point. But can you talk, Susan, a bit about the recent things we've seen? I mean, you mentioned on the anti-camping, you got the Supreme Court reversed that, so there's really nothing to hide behind there. Cities just have to do this. The other two big things that have happened: Prop 36, which was passed last year in November, but what about Prop 1, which Newsom has been touting? That was his big flagship thing in March last year on the ballot, which just squeaked through barely. That was supposed to deal with this mental health thing, wasn't it?
Well, it was sold that way, but it was really a terrible, just a terrible measure. It changed the Mental Health Services Act from 2004, which was the millionaire's tax. There was a 1% tax on the incomes of people making $1 million in California to fund mental health services. And once again, this was for all the people who are suffering from homelessness and to provide the services that are needed. What Prop 1 did was take a bunch of that money and divert it to housing. It increased the state's share, I think, from 5% to 10% for administration and programs that the state runs. And then it required the counties to spend 30% of the revenue they were receiving, not on programs that they were currently running, but on housing for the chronically homeless. Well, this gets into that argument about whether everything in California policy is driven by developers and the donations from developers. You really have to wonder. I mean, transit and housing and everything seems to be directed toward sending big contracts to favored developers and the union contracted construction firms that they hire. And there's a lot of money. There's billions of dollars, and nobody knows why we're not getting any result for it. And I would submit that that's a good place to start looking.
It's amazing. So the thing that was sold as dealing with mental health actually ends up cutting mental health budgets.
Cutting the services that the counties provided, exactly.
Yes, and I think the other point, Susan, that we should mention here is that all of the units that are being developed for these patients, these people who have mental illness, again, that there's no required treatment. They can choose whether or not they want to engage in services. And that is such a fallacy that will happen, because so many of them also suffer from a disease called anosognosia, which is a deficit of self-awareness. They are too sick to realize their illness and to request these kinds of services. And as I pointed out in the Boston study, it's just, after you place these people in these units, half are dead after 5 years. It's
The
crazy.
saddest thing of all, really, is that the largest mental health care facility in the United States is the Los Angeles County jail system.
Yeah.
And what that means is we wait until someone else is hurt, and then we arrest the person who's mentally ill and put them in the jail system, which is the worst possible thing you could do to anyone. And then they receive mental health care, but you can't stay in jail forever. It's not a hospital. It's not a mental health institution. They're released. What happens to them when they're released? They go to a community clinic with a piece of paper. This is not adequate. This is not humane. This is not civilized. This has to stop. We have to have adequate facilities to care for people. We have to triage the homeless population and provide the services that are appropriate to people in each situation.
That's right.
So let's just look at that now. Let's just quickly end with a couple of the specific solutions. So on that last point, that feels in a way the easiest to address, because the waiver is there. You don't need to do it. You just have to apply for the waiver, and then you can start building or providing mental health services on the scale and in the way that we need, which is going to be 16 beds. The costs make that prohibitive. So you could do that today, Susan, right? Because the
Correct.
first okay. Now on housing first, Michele, let's look at that one. You've got two sources of the problem. You've got HUD and you've got the state law. With HUD, is it the case that so that's a policy, was it an act of Congress or just a policy from HUD? In other words, could this be overturned with the stroke of a pen of the current HUD secretary?
No, in fact, the Obama administration was very clever. Some of this needs to be unraveled by Congress, and some is regulatory, right, which they could do through administrative action. But it's a very complex web that they wove. I will say, right now, HUD is considering, number one, reducing almost 84% of the staff who administer the homeless assistance grants. And really reorganizing. They're also considering block granting those funds. So those funds won't necessarily go away. They might be reduced, but they're also considering block granting those funds to states. I personally am much more in favor of them being block granted to counties for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into today. But we're looking at some very significant shifts over there. And what I hope, if they do block grant, is that there are conditions on those funds to be spent on rehabilitation and, mental health, drug and alcohol services, employment training, very, very different conditions than we have under Housing First.
So we should be lobbying the HUD secretary, basically, on that,
yes,
for that
absolutely.
change. Right. And in terms of the California law, that would need to be overturned somehow. I mean, do Democrats still support this law?
They do. And Gavin Newsom is hanging on hook, line, and sinker. In fact, today, I wrote about this on Twitter. He was out there talking about how he's got this shiny new accountability system that, is making counties fill in, their performance. And he's completely neglecting the fact that he has handcuffed all of the state money to this Housing First policy. So, he's like shooting holes in the ship and then blaming the crew as it's sinking. It's crazy.
It's interesting because they do talk about treatment a lot. They talk about get people the treatment they need and the mental health. That was part of Prop 1. But Susan, is it just complete gaslighting? They're not prepared to change the basic barrier to getting people treatment, which is Housing First.
Well, they object to compulsion of any kind.
Right.
They do not want courts to order people into treatment. They do not want a requirement that you have to be in a sobriety program in order to qualify for subsidized housing or free housing. They don't like compulsion. They feel that you should give people everything they want or need, and everything else should be optional. And honestly, from a taxpayer perspective, that's pretty harsh, because the people who are paying the taxes for these billions and billions of dollars of programs, the money that goes to the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that provide these services, the big contracts, the money that goes to developers to build, this is coming from the checks of people who are having trouble paying their own housing costs. And it is cruel to say that the people who are paying these taxes must continue and even pay more. Los Angeles County just raised the sales tax for more of this. People are in line at McDonald's to get dinner for their family, and the tax that they're paying is going up because the government wants to give it to people who are actively using hard drugs. And there's just something deeply unfair about that.
Yeah, well put. And what about the other, in terms of compulsion, though, can you just quickly hit this and then we better wrap it up and I'll give you the last word, Michele. Susan, the two things that are on my mind as to, moving us forward a little bit on compulsion. Well, actually, I want to note something, which is before we get asked those questions, which is it's part of it brings to mind a whole chapter in my book, California Failure. We're going through the structure of the book, the first part, which is looking at the reasons we're in this mess in California. I call them pathologies, the ideological pathologies that have driven all this. So elitism and cronyism and all this climatism. But one I've got in there is compassionism. And there's this ideological obsession with looking compassionate, but it's not compassionate. It's cruel. It's the opposite of compassion.
It's hideous.
Yeah. Well, look, the two things though that I think have moved us a little bit towards compulsion. Prop 36 has that, was it treatment mandated felony? Is that right?
Hmm.
And then also
Yes.
you have the conservatorship law. What was that?
Well, the counties are not implementing that. They've stalled the implementation of it, but it was to make it easier to do involuntary commitment of people who are suffering from gravely disabling mental illness. I believe it changed the definition slightly of gravely disabling mental illness. And the governor signed that law, but the counties are not implementing it because they don't like compulsion.
Right.
It's
There's
very
the same
difficult for the
ideology. Yeah.
Right. It's very difficult for the families of people who are suffering. The families will seek help and they're told they're not enough beds or you can't do anything, or because everything is sort of angled toward free will of people who are not able to make their own decisions for their own
Yeah.
welfare.
Yeah. Okay. Last word, Michele.
Well, I would just say, Steve, I know you know this, but I ran a program for homeless women and children for 13 years, and then wrote a book about the experience and continue in this line of work because I saw in 13 years that when you provide the transitional housing and the support in combination, and in many cases we required it. We had rules, curfew, and chores, and engagement, employment training. But when you do that, people can recover. They do recover, and hundreds of women who are single mothers are now homeowners in California, which is a feat in and of itself. But to have come from the depths of despair, this is possible. People can be restored, and we need to be focused on helping them do that.
Well, thank you both very much. And I would urge everyone who's listening, if you're interested in this, to read the report. It's on goldentogether.com, called Ending Homelessness. And there's much more detail and a reminder of many of the points that we've discussed. It's so outrageous to me. It's so sad that this is being left to fester for so long. And they brag about us being the 5th largest economy in the world and all this. And they've let this happen. And it's deliberate. It's a deliberate policy. But that means it can be reversed, and it should be.
Yep.
Thank you both so much for being with us today, and of course for your help with the report.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, so it's not a new topic for this section of the show where I get worked up over something and say I want to get this off my chest. But it's unbelievable. Karen Bass, the mayor of LA, yet again making it worse. It is absolutely astonishing to me how this person, almost every time she goes out there, makes the situation worse. So last week, she ends up doing a bunch of different interviews, compounding the egregious, it's beyond incompetence. It's just total disregard for the expectations of accountability that you have for a public official. So there are just 3 things just last week that she did. First of all, she turns around and says, when asked about how long it will take to rebuild, remember that event with President Trump where she's sitting there and he's saying, come on, it's too slow. And she says, yeah, I'm going to get all the barriers out of the way. We're going to rebuild quickly. It's all going to be fine. Now she's saying, when asked specifically how long it's going to be before people can rebuild, she says, maybe 3 years, probably 5 years. 5 years. I mean, what are you talking about? 5 years? We literally built the Golden Gate Bridge from scratch in 4 years. And you're telling me that one house in Los Angeles, she's saying it's going to be 5 years. I mean, it's just complete madness. The attitude of these people, just zero hustle or energy or anything. Unbelievable that she sits there and says that with a straight face and all very pompously, oh, well, it's very complicated. We have to do all this. What? What are you talking about? Unbelievable. Then the second thing is she says, this is just the part that reminded me of some crazy, it really did remind me of a kind of communist era apparatchik, where they're just completely lost in their own bureaucracy and processes because there's never any competition. It's one party state and it's all just, set up in this particular way. So she was asked about going to Ghana. Remember the sequence of events? The first weather warning from the National Weather Service about these terribly dangerous winds was January the 2nd this year. January the 3rd, it was upgraded. The warnings were upgraded to describe them as life-threatening risk. And then on the 4th, she flies to Ghana. And then on the 6th, she's from Ghana tweeting about how, be careful about these things. So, she's just all over the place. But now she's asked about going to Ghana. And she said, oh, that's going to be investigated. What? What do you mean? So she's announcing an investigation into herself. And you think, what's the investigation? It's just like wrong. You shouldn't have gone. What are you talking about? What is there to investigate? It's a massive error of judgment. But then the third thing that really kind of brought it to a head and really captured what an absolutely appalling, blame-shifting career politician she really is, clinging to power at any price, was firing the fire chief. She sacked the fire chief, Kristen Crowley, in Los Angeles. And by the way, I totally disagree with those people, including Rick Caruso, who've been running around saying, oh, the brave fire chief, she stood up to Karen Bass, should never have been fired. Yes, she should. They all should. Basically, Karen Bass was a disaster. The fire chief was a disaster. It's true that the fire chief made all these mistakes, including letting 1,000 firefighters or whatever go off shift that day, not pre-positioning fire truck. There's a whole list of things that the fire chief did wrong. So it's absolutely right. And she should have resigned, just as Karen Bass should have resigned. And you can add to the sort of woeful, lamentable trilogy here of these useless people in charge, the head of the Department of Water and Power, who let the reservoir, the famous Santa Ynez Reservoir now, was sitting empty for a year, even though it was specifically built in order to deal with a situation like this. That person as well, on $750,000 a year, by the way, totally useless. So all three of them, as far as I'm concerned, if they had any kind of shame or dignity, honor, whatever word you want to use, would have resigned by now. Because this absolutely catastrophic failure. Of course, it's true. I don't have to go all the arguments again. Yes, the winds are a naturally occurring phenomenon, but the fires were not. They were made so much worse by policy failures, both in the years leading up to it, with the brush that was led to accumulate, making the spread of the fires so much more rapid and dangerous, but also the failures of preparation and response, failure to do anything about these warnings, pre-position equipment, make sure the water was there. All those things were not done. So these people are all a disgrace. All of them should have resigned. But the fact that you've got Karen Bass firing the fire chief, trying to sort of blame her as if it had nothing to do with her own decisions, was just absolutely despicable. Like really, really nasty, unpleasant, morally offensive behavior. And so this person, Karen Bass, I mean, as I said, she seems to have this incredible ability to make it worse every single time. And I am very, very convinced, she's obviously not going to go of her own volition, but I think people are sick of this. And I think she will be gone one way or another. All right, everybody, that is our show for this week. Who knows what'll happen next week, whether we'll be covering the resignation of Karen Bass or sanity on homelessness or any of these things. We'll see. Make sure you follow us on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and join us again next week for the next episode of The Steve Hilton Show.